My favorite answer in what can people do in almost any question is to talk to each other. You don't have to fight people on these things. If you can be constructive in your conversations.
Hi, humans! Welcome to Demystifying Science, the only out-group coverage of the human condition in the entire galaxy.
Today, we spoke with Mick West, self-proclaimed conspiracy debunker and author of the book Escaping the Rabbit Hole, all about how to have productive conversations with people that are promoting alternative or controversial narratives.
Mr. West started out as a video game designer. He coded the first 5 games of the popular Tony Hawk series during his time at Neversoft, and it seems like that's where his fascination with debugging got off the ground.
Initially, he became interested in alternative or alt theories after learning about the chemtrail movement while studying for his aviation license.
He was interested enough that he started a website to dispel the idea that condensation trails from commercial airliners were surreptitiously hiding a shadowy government program that sprays climate-changing chemicals on a naive populace.
Though he believed it'd be a quick job, the opposition turned out to be rather resilient, and he's still at it more than a decade later.
He's since then expanded his debunking projects to include UFOs, various forms of pseudoscience, and all kinds of paranormal stuff.
And over the years, he's become something of an expert in these subjects and has even co-authored a paper with several atmospheric scientists.
We spoke with him all about methods for evaluating information, the dangers of conspiratorial thought, censorship, and contemporary alt-media surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic on Earth.
And what was most interesting about our conversation was when we drilled into the idea that distrust seems to stem from a very personal sense of powerlessness amongst individuals.
Mr. West calls this the loser syndrome, where underdogs are more likely to ascribe to alt narratives.
Important note, this isn't because they're actually losers, but because folks who end up on the losing end of a power struggle are more likely to think that the deck was stacked against them.
And this really opens up a new conversation for another day, maybe. How can you humans forge a civilization capable of providing a safe, healthy sense of existence for everyone, including those that lose the job, election, or whatever other game they're playing?
We think you'll really like this one, humans.
Take care, and we'll see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. It's the best possible way to keep this old space tub buzzing with great conversation.
Yeah, and don't forget to comment too. We love to get your messages out here in space.
Enjoy, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye!
You're a human conspiracy debunker.
I am a human conspiracy debunker, and that's what people call me anyway. I also call myself just a debunker, or sometimes just an investigator.
Investigator. I like that.
How did you get started with that?
I've been interested in the topics that I debunk, that I investigate for a long time. I've always been interested in unusual happenings since I was young, a young earthling. And so I just kind of followed my interests as I grew older.
Has there been anything that you debunked that ended up actually having happened?
Not really, but I think that's kind of to do with the subject matter I choose. I usually look at things where people are making claims about a particular topic, and they seem to me initially to be somewhat outrageous or false, or just not really backed by evidence. And so I tend to look at things that, in a way, are already unlikely to be true. And I find that the things that are likely to be true, there's already a lot of other people looking at those things. So I found a niche kind of on the edge where some people think they're true, but they're generally not.
And do you have any interest in those other topics that are sort of on the spectrum?
Sure, no, I'm interested in the entire range of, I guess, conspiracy theories. Like Yeah, the simplest conspiracy theories are just that people cheat at various things and cover it up. Or they break the rules and they don't get caught. They work together to break the rules. These things we know that they happen all the time. Like politicians often say things, well, do things that are just kind of either skirting the rules or breaking the rules. And sometimes they do things that are illegal and they get caught. But obviously, a lot of the time, they're going to do things and not get caught. So I would say conspiracies are very real. But when we talk about conspiracy theories, the fact that it's a theory in this sense, in the vernacular sense, not in the strict scientific sense of a theory, but the vernacular sense of a theory is a hypothesis or something you're postulating might be an explanation, almost like a guess or
And it's like an
something you would
alternative
prefer.
too, right? There's like something alternative implied in the word conspiracy theory on Earth, it seems like.
Yeah, it's a conspiracy theory generally means something that is an alternative to the generally accepted explanation. If there's no explanation for something, then everything that you think is a possible explanation is a theory about that explanation, a hypothesis, if no one actually knows. But if someone says they know, if they say, for example, this person was killed by this person, and then you say, no, it wasn't, then you're doing this alternative theory, which is kind of another good word for it as well, like alternative.
I like that.
Often people use alternative and they abbreviate it as alt. So the alts, alt science, for example, you could say would be alternative science. But yeah, conspiracy theories give you an alternative.
So, of the theories that you've studied, what has been the weirdest one that you've stumbled?
Well, it's hard to say because there's almost like no stopping once you get to the strange end of conspiracy theories. Things that seem obviously strange, like the theory that the Earth is flat, when we know from science and observation and years of history and practical experience and just simple mechanics that the Earth is in fact a oblate spheroid, like nearly perfectly round. But people think that it's flat, and that seems really, really weird because it's completely at odds with reality. But then people believe in things that are completely at odds with reality all the time. There's lots of people who believe in some kind of magic or supernatural or some kind of supernatural beings.
Deism, right?
A lot of people believe in some kind of deity, like some kind of god who has some kind of supernatural influence in the world and can do these things and kind of exists in a way outside of the universe as we know it, which is a very strange thing. Like, is that more or less strange than believing the Earth is flat? I suppose one thing comports with observations in that we can see the world, and then all we're doing is saying that there's external explanations for it. But then the other one is saying the world actually is different to how we observe it, or we interpret the observations differently.
Well, this seems like such an ancient human tendency, right? So there used to be religion and other things that could be pointed to that happened behind the scenes. And
Sure.
It seems like you humans have lost a little bit of religion over the course of the last century or so.
Yeah, well, there's lots of theories about why people are religious. Beyond the obvious that perhaps there really is a God, and this God has visited people. If that's that explanation aside, but if people are just coming up with religion for some kind of biological reason, almost like some kind of something that's hardwired into our brains, there's lots of theories that to do with like how consciousness evolved. Did consciousness evolve? Did consciousness kind of rely upon some kind of external explanation for something, or perceiving external explanations for things, rather
to give it structure or something?
Yeah, as if things just happen completely at random, then perhaps that's just in a way the way the lesser animals perceive the world. Like, just things are just something pops up in and the animals just carry on. It's always amazing to me, like how unworried animals often seem about things and how quickly they adapt to new situations. Like, I just moved house, and for me it was very, very traumatic. But for the dogs, they were just they just accepted it straight away, and they were right into it, because I think they don't think about things. But because intelligent humans, I think, have developed over the course of their evolution some kind of external model of the world, which they carry in their heads and that they use to inform their actions, then the way they form this model of the world is a very, very big part of what they do. And that can lead to these things if the model of the world is either kind of twisted or doesn't quite exactly match reality. And then it can lead to, I don't know, are dogs conspiracy theorists?
Probably when
they
you
are,
leave
in a
the
way.
house, I'm sure that they are.
Yeah. My dogs just lay by the door until I get back. So it's, don't think they really think about what I'm actually doing whilst I'm gone. They just know that I'm gone and then I come back.
I wish we could get a dog up here.
One day. So it seems like what you're saying is that there's these two aspects, which is the model of the world and reality. And as society gets to be more and more complex, it becomes much more difficult to create an actual model of the world that reflects the complexity of reality.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that those two forces are creating some of this tendency?
I do. I think people like to have a simplified and structured model of the world. I think it kind of dates back to the earlier stages in human evolution, when we were just in smaller bands and you would only have the people around you. And then everything external to that was the others, the external forces. So you've got your close band of people, and then you've got the external forces. And when bad things happen, it's usually from external forces. But now the human perception of the world has expanded beyond this original small band of people to the entire world, and it's kind of fractured and spread over the world. And so our notion of what these external forces has changed. Like for the idea of a government, for example, maybe doesn't really fit very well with the way humans evolved. If humans evolved to be in small bands, they're used to having a very small group of people that they know and that they have relationships with, that actually are providing the structure for their society. But if you have a government, this kind of big body that's at the top of the hierarchy, is far away in many cases, and you don't really have any interaction with, then I think you get kind of a conflict between it being part of your society, but also an external force. So it's this external, it's this something strange in the jungle feeling that you have. You don't know whether it wants to do good for you or do bad for you. So it's kind of a natural sense of distrust of this powerful thing. But then it's also a conflict, because we're brought up to trust, to a large degree, things, the institutions, the larger institutions like science and medicine and education, and to a certain extent, the government. And so we're brought up to trust this, and that we have this conflict.
It's really interesting that originally it seems like in human evolution, the government and the supernatural translators, the religious architects, were the same people, right? Seems like in your Bible, for instance, the laws are included alongside the supernatural stories. So perhaps the treatment of the state as an other, as this supernatural being, is an inheritance of that paradigm.
Yeah, supernatural being as being the state. That's an interesting thought. I think it's kind of difficult to if I think about how I look at the state, I grew up in the UK, in a part of the world which is a bit more tending towards a socialist style of government. And in the United States, there's a bit less of a socialist style of government, with socialist meaning that the government provides more for the population and does more to do with caring for people, taking care of people and educating them, and perhaps interfering more with the economy and things like that. And when I grew up, I didn't have a sense of distrust of the government. But when I came over here, it was kind of different. So I think it kind of varies by country.
Do you think that most people in the UK trust the government right now? Because it seems like there was a terrible, terrible cliff that much of the Western world fell off of, where around the time of maybe JFK, faith in the government was something like 70-80% of people trusted the government.
Right.
And then you look at these polls and it just goes off a cliff. We're down to 10% of people trusting in the government at this point.
Yeah, well, I think the highest level of trust of the government was after 9/11, when there was this big kind of external attack.
Really?
And the approval ratings of the president at that time, I think, were around 90%. I think they were 89%. Which was incredibly high, because I think just the day before, his approval ratings were something like 35 or 40%.
Wow.
So when there wasn't any kind of external threat to society, like, people kind of, I think, distrust the government more. And when there was this external threat, the very, very violent attack on America, people realized that their internal differences were less, and that they have an external enemy, and that in this case the government is their friend.
Why didn't
it's interesting to
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's interesting to look at that now, and we have this problem with the virus.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Which is that an external threat? I think some people try to frame it as an external threat in a way, like saying, the Chinese were responsible, but it really is a global issue, and it's not coming from outside anywhere.
But it hasn't had the same sort of unifying effect, right?
It hasn't, but exactly because it is not an external threat. It's not as if we know that aliens, and the present company accepted, were responsible for this threat, and we could band against these aliens, or that we could band against a particular country.
I see.
So we've no one to blame. We can't really, start getting angry with nature and start pointing fingers at nature and saying our government will protect us from nature. It's just something that's all around and pervasive.
So do you think that's what's led to blaming this on shadowy cabals and pointing the finger at guys like Bill Gates or those kind of things?
I think, whenever any big bad thing happens, there's always going to be some people who point a finger at shadowy cabals. After 9/11, there was lots of trust in the government initially, and lots of support for the government at least. But there was also a lot of people who thought there was something shady about it from the start. So people were pointing fingers at shadowy cabals right at the start. If you look at people who are long-term conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones, he was saying right from the start there's something suspicious going on here. And with the coronavirus, we get the same thing. We get people saying there's something suspicious. So it's I think the fact that it's not an external threat perhaps makes people seek explanations a bit more, and perhaps point the finger internally rather than externally. But you're still gonna, whatever happens, whenever something bad happens, like there was just a hurricane here. It wasn't even a particularly big one, but it did quite a bit of damage in Louisiana. But there are people who think that was something that was created by the government, essentially, as some kind of distraction from something, or it was part of some broader plan of forcing people away from the coast so they would live inland, or some kind of depopulation agenda. So no matter what happens, there's always some people who will come up with conspiracy theories.
That's fascinating.
There does seem to be some grain of truth in many of them, though. That if you dig down far enough, you seem like you reach this point where people have a concern that is perhaps reasonable. Where if you look at... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, because every conspiracy theory is kind of based on not necessarily facts, but more like fears, which are somewhat well-founded. The idea that the government might do something nefarious to stay in power or to further its goals is, it's a real concern. And it's something that may have happened to some degree and probably will happen. Like the idea that, say, 9/11, there was these attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and maybe the White House, and they the idea that was fate is quite a pretty outrageous idea, because it's such an extreme thing, killing like thousands of people, potentially tens of thousands of people, depending on what time of day it would have been, and had the other attacks been successful. But then you look back and you see, like, when the government was trying to make the case for invading Iraq by saying that there were chemical weapons in Iraq, or weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and it turns out that there weren't, and that the evidence for them was kind of inflated. Did the government do these bad things? Did they actually lie to the public about things? And did they even maybe fake a bit of evidence, or like ignore certain reports that said, like, there is no uranium here and things like that? The government, people in the government, not necessarily the government as a whole, but individuals within the government and groups within the government have done things which are just basically misleading the public, or taking actions to mislead the public, which further their own goals. So it's a question of, is there a line up which they will not cross? Humans historically have done some pretty horrible things. It doesn't seem to me like, the US government is currently doing things like pretending to attack the World Trade Center, or actually attacking it, or arranging for these attacks. But I don't think it's something that we should automatically dismiss as outrageous and impossible out of hand, because it might be that we get this creeping increments of things which kind of lead in that direction.
Right. So it's been established that bad things have happened in the past. What's the proper way to investigate these matters?
I guess the question is, where do these things go off the rails?
Yeah, where do they go off the rails? Where does a presentation, a conspiracy theory, turn into a conspiracy theory, as opposed to just an investigation?
Yeah, as opposed to somebody raising their finger and being like, well...
It's when people make specific claims about specific pieces of evidence. When they say that this shows that this happened. Like, for example, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and we know that he was shot. And Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for it, and he was up in the book depository, and we know that that certain things happened. But then people make different claims about that particular thing, and then they base a theory on that. Like, they will say that for the one shot that went through Kennedy's back to have ended up where it ended up, it would have had to stop and change direction in midair. So they make this claim that they say is actually evidence of a conspiracy theory. Because if this claim was true, if this bullet could not have done made these particular holes in these people, then somebody else must have fired an additional shot, which means it must have been a conspiracy. But
it's almost like the certainty is the problem. It's almost like the expressed certainty, but that could happen on both sides of the argument, right?
It's really certainty about. It's a combination of things. Like, there's two things people are certain about. They're certain because they've done research, that they feel they've done research, and they feel that they figured it out, and they feel that they know the answer. And then they feel certain that these pieces of evidence support them. But in some ways, they're kind of doing it backwards. They've arrived at the conclusion, and then they're looking for supporting evidence. And so they only look at things that they think support them. And then they don't critically look at that evidence. So they think, oh, yes, obviously Kennedy was assassinated. Obviously, they think that. And then they think, oh, what evidence do I have that I can share with my friends to convince them? And then they say, oh, there's this magic bullet thing, which is obviously, could not have happened. So I'll tell people about that. But then they don't look any further into it. Or they will hear, for example, that the shots were fired too fast. There was no way anybody could possibly let off 3 shots with that particular gun. And you get people who promote conspiracy theories, like Jesse Ventura, who actually got the gun, and on his television show, he tried firing 3 things, and he said kind of like, I can't do it, it's got stuck, I'm not firing it right. And he couldn't do it in his experiment. But he's a conspiracy theorist.
But other people have, right?
People have. That's the thing. Like individual investigators back in the 1960s, they did recreations of it, and they got, I think, 10 different guys who were, of comparable skill level to Lee Harvey Oswald to try it out, and they could do it. Because I think they weren't burdened with this expectation that they wouldn't be able to do it. Was Jesse Ventura actually faking it, or was there some kind of mental block that made him feel like he couldn't do it, some kind of psychosomatic thing? I think probably he was just faking it. But people
get really invested. They get really invested in their perspective.
Yeah, and they want these particular claims to be true, and they defend them really, really strongly. I have a lot of trouble kind of getting through to people because they feel very sensitive about individual things. I mean, you're right; they are invested in not only the theory as a whole, but each little nugget of information. They will defend this magic bullet theory, and you have to be really, really explicit in explaining what went on there.
So this is interesting. Have you seen, there's this movie that's circulating right now that illustrates this really well, Plandemic?
Yeah, Plandemic, which is a movie where they make the case that the coronavirus pandemic was planned. And this is the same type of thing. It's basically a collection of what they claim to be evidence, and in a lot of cases, it's not really evidence at all. It's just somebody asserting something. But then they will point to other things and say, this is evidence. Like they will say, Dr. Fauci, who's the leader of the coronavirus response team, Dr. Fauci has some kind of financial incentive in the pandemic. So he's essentially kind of part of the whole plot. But if you look into that, you find out he doesn't really have a financial incentive. He has something like possibly making $500 off a very small share in some patent that he had as part of his work from years ago. So, but people will keep repeating those things though because it supports the theory. So they cling on to these little nuggets that they think are actual evidence when they're actually not.
Well, it's kind of sad because perhaps there are conflicts of interest that could be rooted out and dealt with, and the public should be concerned about. But it seems like there's something with the presentation style that results in a piece like this going off the rails.
Well, yeah. It seems like it's a conversation that's more about the issues with lobbying and revolving door between the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry, and issues with being able to patent a gene or a treatment and how much money you make off of that. These are these grains of truth in the movie.
Mm-hmm. There's a really intelligent discussion to be had there, but there's something about the context in this emotionally laden piece. I mean, it's so really well done. It's really gets your blood stirring.
That's how they get you. And a lot of the people who get into conspiracy theories now, especially, start out by watching a well done video like that. There's a famous one called Loose Change, which a lot of people said that they got into 9/11 conspiracy theories because of that. And then there's on the chemtrails conspiracy theory, there's a couple of documentaries. There's one called What in the World Are They Spraying, which was this also very compelling documentary if you don't know anything about the actual claims of evidence. And now you get this pandemic, and there's probably other ones to do with like 5G things. There's documentaries that say global warming is a hoax. There's all kinds of documentaries saying that the government is covering up crashed flying saucers. So there's all these. If you only look at one side, it's quite easy to get sucked in because you're just looking at an advocate for one side. You're not looking at an information source, really. You're looking at someone who's trying to persuade you. And I always draw the analogy with a courtroom. Here we have a system where in the courts you have a jury of 12 people, and then you have two advocates, two lawyers, and both of those people will try to make the case, and they're very, very strongly not really trying to be even-handed. One person is being very biased to one side, and the other person is being very biased to the other side. One's prosecutor and one's the defense. And so the jury listens to both sides and then makes a decision based on this. And the lawyers cross-examine the witnesses. One person brings up a witness, the other person cross-examines them. So one person makes their case, someone does a rebuttal of that case. And the jury listens to both and decides. But if you took that same jury and they were only ever allowed to listen to one side, they were only ever allowed to listen to the prosecution and only the prosecution's witnesses, and only the prosecution's questioning of their witnesses, and the defense lawyer was not allowed to speak at all or make any case, the prosecution could make the most compelling case in the world because there's no one to rebut it and there's no one to present alternative facts. And that's what happens when you watch these documentaries. If you don't get the other side, and often there isn't an equally compelling documentary saying that these things are false. You've only got this one thing because most scientists are not really interested in these kind of fringe topics. So you get people ending up just watching this one compelling documentary, and they're only seeing one side. And of course they get sucked in. It's the only rational thing to do because they've got this compelling case laid out before them. So they just accept it as true.
Do you think that justifies throwing the case out of court completely, like Google blocking Plandemic from showing up on your browser?
Well, no, I don't think you should throw things out just because there isn't another side to the argument. You throw things out because they're blatantly false. Multiple independent fact checkers have gone through Plandemic. When I say multiple, I mean scores, maybe as many as 100. I'm sure you can find many, many, many articles, many individual people, many doctors, many scientists doing their responses to this thing because it was such a big thing. And they've pointed things out. It's not just that they're simply arguing. They're not just simply advocating. They're pointing out things that you can check for yourself, which are blatantly false, that are in this documentary.
So it gets to be one level more complicated because if you look at the second movie, they address this by basically attempting to undermine the validity of the entire fact-checking system.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing. It's fact-checking, in theory, should be this neutral thing, and generally it is. When I do fact-checking, I'm just looking at a fairly narrow claim. I'm trying to see if it's true or false. But because fact-checked reality tends to favor one side, the side of that is not full of lies, then it gets attacked. People will say Wikipedia is some kind of disinformation. Wikipedia, the online encyclopedia, they will say that I, Mick West, am some kind of government agent. They will say Snopes, which is this fact-checking site, everything in Snopes is false because it disagrees with them. So yeah, you can. It's a problem, and I actually have a chapter in my book about this as a problem and how you need to be aware of it if you are a fact checker, and you can't always just simply give people the correct facts and they will trust you. You need to establish a relationship with them, essentially. And if the relationship is broken, if someone starts saying that Snopes is propaganda, then they're just not going to trust that information source.
So you lay out some method in this book?
Well, my method for avoiding that problem myself is to be very honest with people about who I am. People say, I must be a government shill. I must be paid by the government because why else would I be doing this? And so in the book and all the time in real life, like right now, I will explain who I am, where I came from, why I do what I do, why I think it's important. And not only that, I establish common ground with people by explaining to people that I don't trust the government. I think the government does bad things. And I think that we should have scrutiny of the government, and I'm opposed to a lot of the things that they are opposed to. but I'm also interested in fact checking. And I think that if we are going to distrust the government and investigate the government, then we don't want all this false stuff cluttering up our investigations. We don't want people looking into Pizzagate if Pizzagate is complete nonsense. We want people, looking into things like Watergate was back in the day, and whatever the current things are that are issues. We want people looking into: is the post office being dismantled or not? Is that a conspiracy theory on one side, or is it being misrepresented by the other side? But it's an important thing. We've got an election coming up. The post office is going to play a big part in it. So what's going on with the post office, or how it's being portrayed, is very, very important. We don't want people just wasting all their time thinking that 5G causes coronavirus when there's actually real issues that they could be focusing on.
So this is like a meta conspiracy theory, a conspiracy of conspiracy theories, where this amount of false information forces people to actually not pay attention to what's happening and what's important.
Yeah, and this is something it's seen on all sides as well, or perceived on all sides. I as a non-conspiracy theorist, generally, like a person who finds most of the conspiracy theories to be false, and I think that the more reasonable conspiracy theories are what we should focus on. I see these things as being distractions. But people who are further along the spectrum, people who believe that 9/11 was arranged by the government, they will also see conspiracy theories as a distraction, some kind of propaganda to distract people from what they see as the most important issue. They see the cover-up of the 9/11 attacks as the most important issue, and they think that the flat Earth is actually government propaganda, actually a government operation, a psychological operation to distract people from the reality of 9/11. But it kind of doesn't really matter if it was actually arranged that way. This is what actually happens. These things are distracting people. These conspiracy theories, they're distracting people from the real issues, and they're making their attention go in the wrong direction, and sometimes with quite unfortunate and violent results.
Yeah, so what are the other dangers of conspiracy theories? Why is it really a problem?
Well, it's interesting that I think my perception on that has changed over the last 6 months or so.
Cool.
The dangers of conspiracy theories for the individual, are things like health. Like they won't get vaccinated, or they won't get their children vaccinated, or they'll believe that certain things will cure their cancer because the cures are being covered up. There are also issues of distrust in government, meaning that they won't vote based on their rational best interests. They will have this weird idea of what the government does, and they'll vote or not vote based on these strange beliefs rather than on evaluating the policies of the government as to what's actually important. But I think now we're seeing increasingly that essentially what our conspiracy theories are fomenting unrest within the country, and division, and violent action. A lot of what's going on with these clashes between different groups essentially boils down to both sides, perhaps one more than the other, but certainly, both sides are getting a very, very skewed view of what the other side is. And then this kind of comes to a head with certain fractions of these groups who want to take action. So you will get these protesters, or people who go along with the protests, who want to agitate because they want to bring about the downfall of the government, because they believe in all these conspiracy theories about how the government is suppressing all kinds of different things. I don't know the exact details. And then you've got things that on the right wing, people thinking that there's some kind of socialist revolution around the corner, like the Democrats are going to essentially communists, and they're going to put everybody in little apartments and ban private property and stuff like that, which is just equally ridiculous. But you've got these very, very skewed, limited views of the world that are kind of forcing people into action. And I think a lot of the problem boils down to a kind of this this separation of the two groups, and we need a bit more cross-pollination, a bit more a little bit more understanding of one side or another, which you don't get because things like conspiracy theories are naturally polarizing.
And yet, the foundation of both sides seems to be a fear of powerlessness. It's the sense of the world happening beyond your control, and things that you don't really care for are occurring. And somehow, despite the fact that these two sides are looking at things from such different perspectives, neither side feels like the world is going in their direction. And that seems to be the foundation, that things are not going how people want them to go, and they feel like they have absolutely no lever to pull on in order to move them in the direction that they want to go into. Is that a place to start building something off of? If people could actually come to, because again, if you go to this pandemic thing, we always try to look at these sorts of theories and find the fundamental basis. What is the fear? What is the concern? And the concern here really does seem to be the fact that there are really, really big companies, groups that are making decisions that people have absolutely no input on.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with this, the sense of the other out in the jungle, who's the external force that is doing things. With the left-wing people, it's more to do with like the corporations and the fear of some kind of kleptocracy or fascism. Yeah, depending on what you think is going to happen. Like, you got people concerned that we will end up like Russia, where we have a very corrupt ruling elite. And then you've got on the other side the right-wing people who fear things are going in towards like a China type situation, which in some ways is very, very similar to the Russia situation. You're increasingly getting this ruling elite, but yeah, you look at it's interesting, I think, comparing the left and the right wing factions here. The right wing people, it's almost like they're scared about their way of life changing, and that they don't want people telling them what to do or telling them that they can't do certain things, or that they have to accept certain changes in the world. Whereas the left side is more kind of a higher level in a way. It's more like concern about what's going on at the highest levels of government. But I suppose like it varies very much by individual, so it's kind of difficult to characterize just left and right, and I really shouldn't be doing it because lots of people will be saying that's not what I think.
Where's the common ground between the two?
Because that's where if we're going to help the humans figure anything out, we're going to have to figure out what the common ground is for these groups that are willing to, march in the streets against each other for months.
Yeah. Well, there's obviously common ground that all humans have. I mean, we all like to be warm and well fed and in a house, and we like to have jobs, and we like to have meaningful jobs, and we like to be entertained, and we're often entertained by the same things, regardless of our political leanings. I think what we really want to do is kind of try to get the political discussion back to actual politics rather than just a demonization of the other side. I think the common ground that we all share is a desire to solve the problems of the world, and we have different ideas about how we should do that, but we're not really discussing how these different approaches actually apply to our common problem. We have a common problem, say, of homelessness, and homelessness becomes, from the right side, are just simply a way of attacking Democrats. But we really want to try to figure out in a constructive way, and perhaps a scientific way, it's dangerous words in a way, it's how do we actually address these problems? Does one ideology necessarily mean that we cannot address it? Or can we come to some kind of compromise? is the only way of addressing homelessness to get rid of all the Democrats in the world, or is it the only way of doing it get rid of all the corporations and put everybody into a lot of tiny houses? These are extremes, which are essentially just caricatures of one side's position. And really, the common ground is a general desire for things to be good, and the fact that we can both identify problems and that we can work on solving those problems. And that's what we should do. We should actually try to figure out what the actual solution to the problem is.
So the extremist positions seem to be the most tasty media. They seem to get the most views, and this is sort of the pattern of media production on Earth right now. Perhaps...
It always has been, I think.
Yeah, perhaps always has been. Is there a way to produce a balanced, moderated view of what's happening in a way that's still attractive to viewers?
And just sort of the whole grain version of media.
Yeah, well, I think you can't look at the media as some kind of big thing anymore.
No.
No matter what happens, it's going to be this patchwork of things. And these things, like balanced views and discussions and things like that, do exist. I think CBS News just did a little series. I think it was CBS did a little series of things on, I think, the cancel culture and a couple of other kind of similar, modern issues like that. And they did it in a fairly even-handed way, where they got different people on to present their different points of view, and it was a good, thoughtful discussion of the problem. The problem is not so much about producing that, and even with a big platform like CBS, it's getting people to actually watch it, getting that across to people. If they simply don't accept certain news sources or certain points of view, or certain things that they feel is biased, then it doesn't matter if people are actually producing this content, which they are. There's lots of really, really good, healthy content on the internet. It's how do we get people to watch it?
Yeah.
That's kind of a fundamental problem.
Well, it seems like the most exciting media really appeals to people's emotions. And there's something about moderation that leaves people emotionally dry.
It's less intoxicating than convincing them to go to extremes.
Yeah, but then you look at other forms of popular media, which, like The Bachelor, for example, which aren't about exciting things happening. It's just about people's relationships. It's about how people relate to each other. And it's like little stories that people find interesting. A little bit.
And there's nothing salacious or anything in it that draws people?
There is. But there's plenty of shows which are... they're not about violence and things like that. They're not particularly bad. It's just fairly simple things. I think there could be a way of introducing drama into these issues without it being extreme sensationalism.
Does there need to be a villain? I guess you're saying there doesn't need to be a villain. There's probably not a villain in The Bachelor.
There needs to be. I think there's various genres of fiction, like mystery, for example. In mystery, sure, there's a villain, but really the point of it is figuring out how things how things actually happened. And in some case, there isn't actually a villain as such, just a series of unfortunate events. And you look at other shows like Mythbusters, very, very popular show. And it was all about figuring out if a certain thing was true or not. There was no villain involved there, but it was presented in an entertaining way, with drama and characters that compelled the viewers. And now we have lots of very essentially spin-off shows on YouTube. But is there a way of kind of injecting that into something more useful? Well, Mythbusters wasn't useful; it's a good educational show. But can we counter conspiracy theories by doing entertaining shows that also educate? Kind of an open question, really.
Well, and I think that the important thing is that much of the media that I've seen that attempts to counter conspiracy theories is unwilling to consider the grains of truth that these people are really worried about, which is the fact that pharmaceutical companies on Earth do have a really strong control over the government. They spend more money on lobbying than anybody else does.
Mm-hmm.
There's the questions of health and bodily autonomy and what death looks like and all of these questions that are central to human beings' existence are sort of not in their hands. Whether or not that's because of their own choices or not is open for debate, but
so I guess you want a documentary that says your concerns are valid and explains what how your concerns are valid, but these claims are false and are not helping those concerns.
exactly.
So this is true, but that's not helping. Maybe that can be the title of our new show.
I like that very much.
So I wanted to find out a little bit about how folks can go about discerning information on Earth right now, because it seems like you guys are entering this really exciting phase where there's just bundles and bundles of information available everywhere you look. I feel like the average guy on the street's getting hit with contradicting information, exciting information, boring information, expert information, crank information.
More information that you could possibly process in a lifetime.
What kind of methods can you imagine for triaging that information and digging into evidence, appraising evidence?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because if it's a contested subject, you're going to get views from both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, there's the belief that some people hold that electricity is very harmful. And if you're close to like a Wi-Fi router or just like a plug or something like that, so like an outlet, or even like a cell phone, that you're become very, very ill. And if you try to search for information about that, you find loads and loads and loads of information saying that that is true. Mm. And you will also find information saying that it's false. But you actually find more right now. And the last time I looked, more information saying that it's true. So how do you determine whether it's true or not?
It might be true, but it goes back to what you said about psychosomaticness. You might be sick of your cell phone because it's binging all the time and you have no idea how to deal with the influx of information, and you're overwhelmed and you're anxious and you don't like your job. And so it might be making you sick.
That kind of describes a 19th century disease called neurasthenia, which people thought was caused by the fast pace of life and was partly ascribed to the telegraph. They thought because before people had to mail a letter and it take a while before it get there, then you can be even more thoughtful in your communications. But now everybody's like ping-ponging like telegrams to each other all the way across the country. It's causing people to freak out, and they had this thing called neurasthenia. And they also had fears of electricity back then. They thought electricity was causing illnesses, but yeah, like you could say again, like there are valid concerns about the modern way of life. If you spend all your time on the computer, you develop like a bad back and your eye strain and things like that.
Yeah, your eyeballs melt out of your head. You don't sit right. Things get really weird.
Yeah. You start to feel ill. Like, but the getting back to what we're talking about, like how do you discern? How do you actually do research to find out if something is true? And it's actually very, very difficult. I think you have to basically consider the sources. When someone's telling you something, look at who is actually telling you this thing, and are they a trusted source? Of course, now people think, like say the American Medical Association, like a body which is dedicated to promoting the good application of medicine. It might not be a trusted source because it has financial incentives, but that seems a lot more of a trusted source than some small website on the internet or just some
that
YouTube
also
channel.
happens to have financial incentive.
Yeah, they do very much so. And a lot of these people are selling things. If they're selling something, is this is this an issue? But that causes problems. I'm selling a book. I have a book that I sell. Buy my book. So does that mean that I've been corrupted by big publishing?
I knew something was wrong.
No. Yeah. So these are issues. But like for the individual, you want to look essentially at as many sources as possible and try to judge the quality of these sources and see like who's saying the same thing, and are they independent people saying the same thing, or is it all these people who are in this kind of ecosystem who are all saying the same thing? If you've got, say, the health authorities in all these different countries throughout the world all saying the same thing, then that's more likely to be true than just a few websites who are all kind of referring to each other. So look at independent sources, check the quality of those sources, and try to get to the original source of any claim. A lot of times you will see something claimed, and the actual original source can be really hard to find.
I like that.
The average person could actually have a lot of trouble finding that. Like I was looking at a statistic the other day. I was watching this. There was the U.S. Marshals recently did an operation in I think Georgia or Alabama, where they helped the local authorities locate some missing children, and they publicized this. They put out a press release saying that they did this and they located 39 children, which is great. But they put out this bit of B-roll video footage along with it, and it had this slide on there, and it said that why should we worry about, I think, children are at risk? Kind of a leading question. But like one of the things they listed was the value of this was like a $25 billion market in the US.
Wow.
This was a statistic that they put up there. Yeah, I mean, wow, it's amazing. $25 billion in like, whatever, like human trafficking, essentially, in the US. But the problem is that was a false statistic. And I started looking into it, and it actually dated back to a false statistic that arose, I think, over 15 years ago, and has somehow kind of leaked out into the media, and it got repeated here. And then this guy, obviously, when he was doing his presentation, which he was giving to the U.S. Marshals, he might have been a marshal himself. He just looked up on the internet, like, what is the value of the human trafficking market in the U.S., and wrote down 25 billion. And because it'd written on a slide about child human trafficking, then it becomes this 25 billion in children human trafficking, when in fact, like the entire human trafficking market value in the US is probably less than 1 billion. And the 25 billion was actually a worldwide figure given by an estimate back in 2005 by the United Nations. So,
and you can't actually, sitting in that room, raise your hand and be like, well, actually, if you have the statistics.
Yeah, you can't say that sounds wrong. Yeah.
So it has this tendency to propagate pretty strongly.
Indeed, yeah. And also there's an issue with that particular topic, because everybody wants to help the children. And you've got this horrible topic of child sexual exploitation. And you don't want to be asking questions. You can say, that doesn't sound that right. It can't be that high.
Exactly.
They had another figure on there, which was like 150,000 children. I can't remember what it was exactly, but exposed to that every year. And that was an entirely bogus figure that was actually investigated, like, I think 5 or 6 years ago by the Washington Post, and shown to be false back then. But it really goes back. That one went back almost 20 years, I think, to the origin of that figure. And yet people just say this is true now. So you've really got to say, where did you get this number from? If someone gives you a statistic, where did it come from? What's the actual true source? Now, if they just cite another news story, that's not the original source. That's just another news story that's repeating it. And then you have to dig back to where did they get it from? And sometimes you can't. So if you can't see the original source of a figure, then treat it as an unproven figure, possibly a false figure, but certainly an unproven figure.
I like that. This kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the ways that information is presented on the internet. There's most web traffic in terms of searches goes through a single portal, which is Google. And there's a pretty opaque mechanism for page rankings and trustworthiness and what gets filtered to the top, right? This isn't some democratic thing where the website that everybody goes to most is going to be at the top. There's something that's a little bit more complex that's actually playing into this.
Yeah.
And I think that this is what freaks a lot of people out, at least from the studying that I've done, which is that when you Google something or you search something on the internet, it's not necessarily representative of an objective perspective. It's representative of some algorithmic ranking system.
Yeah. There's curation, right?
There's curation. So maybe what makes a lot of sense is to encourage people to go to primary sources, but primary sources are usually locked behind paywalls. They're not hosted entirely on the internet, and they're impenetrable. You have to have a doctorate to read a scientific paper. You have to understand statistics. It's just, these papers aren't written for people to understand them. Is there some push on the part of scientists and investigators to produce content that can be read by the average person?
There certainly should be, and I think there is in many cases. But a lot of scientists are just used to doing things this way, and they just keep doing them this way. I was involved in a paper called I can't remember what it's called now. It's only consensus, like estimating consensus of a large-scale atmospheric spraying program, something along those lines. But it was basically this thing where we surveyed scientists and about the chemtrail conspiracy theory. We showed them like photos of supposed chemtrails, which supposed like secret spraying programs, and asked them if they thought this was actually evidence of a secret spraying program, and they generally said no. And we showed them like some chemical tests and stuff like that.
It's but there was some. I pulled it up. It's called "Quantifying Expert Consensus Against the Existence of a Secret Large-Scale Atmospheric Spraying Program." What a title!
Yes, and it really should be called like "What Scientists Think About the Chemtrail Theory."
Exactly. Really this is what I'm talking about.
Right? Yes, quantifying it, but to be taken seriously by scientists, you kind of have to couch things in these certain terms. But there was quite an effort with that particular paper to make it accessible, not just the paper itself, but to have supplemental material around it. One of the authors, Steve Davis, did a few videos kind of explaining what was in it. But there was also a lot of media interest in that paper because it was like, finally, scientists debunk chemtrails once and for all. So there was lots of media coverage. But a lot of that, of course, they don't read the entire paper, and so they kind of perhaps misrepresent it to some degree. It was reasonably good, the media coverage of that thing. But as you know, I'm sure, often when the media reports on a particular bit of science, they're giving you this very, very kind of skewed and sometimes wrong interpretation of what happened. And then, of course, that gets repeated when someone else writes a story based on that story, and then a story based on that story, and then you end up with something completely different from what you started on. So it would be good to have something that was very close to the source, that was an explanation of what's in it. And we do have that, with abstracts of papers, to a certain degree, but no one really reads those either.
I would add to that scientific consensus itself changes, and forget consensus, just that science is a process of debate, really. It's an open conversation, and a lot of people don't realize that if they haven't been on the inside.
Well,
there's a lot of dissension amongst the ranks on any given theory, even within a given institution, despite what
changing. The UFO people like to tell me that it wasn't until relatively recently that meteorites were accepted as being a real thing. There had been tales of rocks falling out of the sky, since the dawn of time, but scientists apparently had always dismissed this as some kind of folk legend or something until I think, the 1800s, very, very recently in scientific terms, like much more recent than you would think.
That's true.
And so they point to that as being an example of, yes, science not having an explanation for something that happened all the time, and there's this kind of revolution in science, like this understanding that rocks actually do fall out of the sky didn't happen until relatively recently. And so why not the same thing with UFOs is how the argument goes.
That seems like a big jump.
It does, but that type of thing, there's a thing called Koch's postulates, which I don't remember what they are exactly, but it's a way in which something becomes science, I believe.
So Koch's postulates are actually all about microbiology and the way that disease is promulgated. And Koch's postulates are really interesting because they're basically mechanisms by which in the 1800s scientists were discovering how germ theory worked. And it was all of these details about, you have to be able to take tissue from a diseased animal and make a healthy animal sick. You have to be able to isolate it from the liquid media that the diseased tissue is in, et cetera, et cetera. But every single one of those postulates, basically within 2 or 3 years, had been proven to have a pretty serious asterisk on it.
They were really broad generalizations, and there are plenty of exceptions immediately.
Yeah.
For viruses, for example, because you can't culture a virus in pure medium.
Right.
And it's technically an infectious agent, but it doesn't follow Koch's postulates or prions.
Well, a virus isn't even an agent, really. It's just a product of a cell.
Yeah, and so there's all these things that they were like, these are the rules! And then immediately afterwards, we're like, well, details.
Yeah, but they like to, conspiracy theorists like to use kind of simplified sets of rules for justifying their beliefs. There's a rather extreme one, which is like, first they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Which they seem to justify their beliefs because they're at the first they laugh at you stage. And they think that somehow this gives them some authority because all great ideas, all great paradigm shifts were laughed at first, which is probably true. And then they were fought in that people say, well, of course, plate tectonics isn't real. That's just nonsense. And why are you pushing this silly idea? And then you win, and then it becomes accepted science. People laugh at things because they're funny and ridiculous, as well as being contrary to the accepted norms. It doesn't actually mean anything, but it's this really, I don't know, kind of a satisfying thing to say. It puts you in good company. You're in the company of Einstein if people are laughing at you.
Well, science is constantly being turned over, and that's the beautiful thing about it. It's interesting because in science, you're really talking about events that have already happened and trying to explain them. And the fundamental basis is that you don't know what happened. So you look at all of these different animals and you try to construct how they came to have all these different appearances, if you're Darwin. Mm-hmm. And you really don't have all of the pieces of the picture. You just have a few frames of the movie, and then you have to supply the movie. So it makes sense that the movie would be changing from year to year as new pieces are filled in or contradictions are discovered.
Yeah, people like to have explanations for things, even if they don't entirely work. Like with like evolution and hereditary, people used to think that if a blacksmith had children, his children would be very strong because he was very strong. And they would think that traits were passed on from the parent to the child through a mechanism that wasn't just genetics. It was actually environmental factors changed the person, and then the child would inherit those environmental factors.
But the crazy thing about that is that you have epigenetics now.
Yeah, so that idea is actually being brought back more to human science than ever before.
And so you went through this idea that was absurd, right? So there's a quote by this chemist whose name was J.S. Haldane, who once said that there are 4 stages of acceptance of a scientific theory. This is worthless nonsense. This is an interesting but perverse point of view. This is true but quite unimportant. And it ends on, I've always said so.
Oh yes, yeah. that reminds me of like similar things with debunking. Like if someone has a piece of evidence like a video, it's first of all, from their perspective, it's almost like the opposite. It starts out as being this most amazing piece of evidence ever that proves this certain thing. And then it devolves through various stages to essentially, oh, that was never important, and I never thought that was important at all. Something else is important, and then there's intermediate stages. Well, perhaps it's that, but it still shows something. But this is like I study UFO videos, and they're going through these stages right now. They think that it's super important. But I'm showing them that it doesn't show them what they think it is, and it becomes less important. But yeah, everyone's hopeful that they are going in the opposite direction, that they are moving towards this banal acceptance. And it is funny how things become banal once they've entered the mainstream. It's almost like it's nicer to have things that are special and out of the mainstream. It's more entertaining. I think people are perhaps drawn to those things. Like if you look at things like my iPhone, for example, back when I was into computers in the 1980s, this is more powerful than all the computers that existed in the world at that time by probably an order of magnitude. Like, all of the computers, every single one put together, is less powerful than my iPhone.
And you probably spend a lot of time cursing your iPhone at this point for how slow it is. I do,
but the point is like it. Back then, that was the most amazing thing ever. But now it's just banal. You've got a miracle in your hand. It becomes banal very, very quickly. But banal things are boring. People like to have things that are entertaining.
And people like to be special. And I think that drives a lot of conspiracy thinking. That people want to be at the center of something that creates a world where they aren't banal.
Yeah. Yeah, they like to feel special. There's a trait that's measurable called the need for uniqueness. And people who score higher on this need for uniqueness scale are more likely to have conspiratorial thoughts. They score higher on the conspiracy belief scale. There's various ways of doing it. Basically, these questionnaires that they give people that give them a score as to how conspiratorial they are. They ask them, do you think it's possible the government was responsible for the 9/11 attacks? Things like that, 1 point. So yeah, they score higher. But my experience with people is that even though there is correlates at a larger broad scale across the population, like with an individual, it's often just down to circumstance whether they become a conspiracy theorist. It's what was going on in their lives at that time. Did they happen to have a lot of spare time on their hands and end up watching a lot of YouTube videos? And which YouTube videos did they happen to watch?
Do you feel like there's some aspect of psychological disenfranchisement, too, that leads into this?
What would you mean by that?
Well, I've seen people write about how anxiety and feelings of powerlessness tend to lead towards higher levels of conspiratorial thinking.
Yeah, that's the kind of conspiracy theories are for losers theory, which is a very unfortunate way of phrasing it, because it basically refers to conspiracy theories about the people in power is more often found amongst people who are on the losing side of the election.
Is that an academic term?
Yeah, it comes from a paper by Joseph Uszynski.
Conspiracy theories are for losers is the title of that one?
Yeah, I think. I'm not sure if that's the title of the paper as such, but it's certainly a title he uses quite a lot.
That's amazing. I imagine that doesn't go very far to,
ingratiate the academics with the conspiracy.
He clarifies it straight away,
Sure.
But unfortunately, I think it's an unfortunate choice of words because it's, if a conspiracy theorist hears that, he says, "Oh, this guy is calling me a loser." And Joe goes, "No, I didn't mean that in that sense. I meant in the sense that your side lost the election." And they're like, "What? No, you're calling me a loser." So it gets attention though. So in some senses it's good, some senses it's bad.
Yeah, of course.
But that's the theory though. That if you are disenfranchised in any sense, you don't like it. People don't like to feel powerless. And they don't like to feel like they're part of a group that is now the underdog, that is fighting against the people in power. There's an other group that's oppressing their group. It's this feeling of insecurity, which is this primal thing that comes along if you've got these external forces around your little camp. Back when 100,000 years ago, when you were just like this little hunter-gatherer group, and you've got these lions circling the camp, then that's the fear that now is kind of, in some sense, transferred onto being on the losing side of an election.
What can humans do to promote a society in their own work, in the media, in their own friend circles, conversations? How can they promote a society that empowers people?
Addresses the concerns of the powerless.
My favorite answer in what can people do in almost any question is to talk to each other. I think, and encourage conversation between people. I think there's a bit of a movement now where people on social media sites like Facebook, if someone that they're friends with or an acquaintance with starts posting something that they vehemently disagree with, then they'll cut them off. They'll unfriend them. And I think that's a very counterproductive thing to do. Like, if your goal is to make the world a better place, the increasing division between people, increasing the isolation between different camps is a very bad thing. And if anything, if social media wants to help, they might want to try introducing mechanisms whereby people don't just have these binary choices of having someone in their feed or not. Like, how can you actually, remain friends with someone on Facebook? Perhaps there's ways it could be done technologically, or perhaps it's just something we need to encourage people to do. I think people have a lot of trouble kind of contradicting someone else or questioning someone's belief. Like, if someone says, like, I think immigrants are criminals, something like that, and you could say, oh, well, you're a racist, I'm not going to talk to you anymore, and then unfriend. Or you could perhaps show them some statistics, and then just showing people statistics by themselves isn't a good thing. Or you could ask them, why do you think that? Why do you think that immigrants are all criminals, or that most immigrants are criminals, or that immigrants have a higher rate of crime than other groups? Where are you getting this information from? It sounds interesting to me. I'd like to learn more about that. So you show me why you're doing that. You don't have to challenge them. You don't have to be, that sounds like racist nonsense. Where do you get that idea? It could be, that's interesting. Where did you hear
Curiosity,
that?
patience.
Is there a statistic that backs that up? Are there a set of statistics? And where do these statistics come from? And what actually are the statistics? And what types of crime are we talking about here? And what constitutes an immigrant? So you don't have to fight people on these things. You can be constructive in your conversations.
I love that. Well, it's been wonderful talking to you. You have shared a lot of really fascinating insight into these matters. I think we need to go study them some more before we take up any more of your time. But could you maybe just plug your book one more time for our Earth listeners?
Yeah, my book is Escaping the Rabbit Hole, How to Debunk Conspiracy Theories Using Facts, Logic, and Respect. And it's basically about how to talk to people who believe in conspiracy theories. I go over kind of the history of conspiracy theories in America and how it got to be where it is today to a certain degree, and people's perceptions of things like the word conspiracy theories. Talk about how to talk to people. I also give a lot of very specific examples, and I interview a number of people and tell their stories in the books about how they escaped the rabbit hole.
Beautiful. We'll we'll give it a good read so we know how to talk to people when we get to Earth. Thank you so much, Mr. West.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.